my name is Jeffrey Alan Scudder, and I'm a contemporary artist, I guess you could say, and an educator, but mainly I'm dealing with painting at the moment, specifically digital painting.
Hello everyone, this is the Artword podcast and I am Jenny Danielson. Welcome to a brand new episode in which I will be talking to Jeffrey, a contemporary artist who deals with digital and painting. It's super interesting and I do hope that you will enjoy it too.
For the last year and a half, I've been going around giving lectures on the topic of radical digital painting, which is a set of ideas that, sort of investigates the kind of ontological reasoning behind digital painting. So it looks at, the term digital and the term painting and tries to reconcile those things and tries to think about what painting could be like in the future. And it's basically an optimistic view of painting's future, I would say.
I agree, because I went to lecture the other day and that's how we met.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I was thinking, why don't we try to talk about digital painting? Because a painting, I think in a traditional sense, would be an object that has a surface, and onto this surface someone has applied various picture elements. But I think a digital painting is a bit more, or something different, right?
Yeah. I mean, generally, you're right. I think we think of painting as being an object, and something where some paint is applied to a surface. And we basically just think of a painting as being something that's made out of some physical material, and that somehow becomes a one thing, whereas a digital painting is basically a configuration of bits, right? So it's a bunch of information, really. Now, that information has to exist somehow in some material form, whether it's on a hard drive or USB stick or even drawn on graph paper or something. The information has to be recorded somehow. So the same way as a regular painting, you still have to put the information somewhere. But the general idea is that the information itself is basically what the work is comprised of. In the same sense that if you were a music composer, it's the notes in the composition and the ordering of the notes that creates the composition, not necessarily the paper that you're using to write those notes on. So digital painting is basically an abstraction outside of the sort of substrate of the different media that we could use for painting. So it's considering painting as if it was sort of not bound by its media, if that makes sense.
Exactly. But then the big question arrives saying, so like the musical score, where is the music? So the music is not actually what is written on that piece of paper, but it's something that can be read by someone and then played on a musical instrument. So where is the digital painting, or when is the digital painting finished or completed? But does it have to take form?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when it comes to just making an oil painting, you have a kind of, you sort of have a really strong symmetry between the relationship of the viewer and the maker, right? So traditionally we think of painting as being something that's it's made in a studio, you put some paint on the surface, and then when you show it, you take it to a gallery or another place, and then people view it basically in the same space as they just view the same object. But just like a musical composition, you might have somebody making their composition in an office or an atelier or something, late at night at 3 a.m., scribbling down the notes. But then people don't actually experience the music until much later at a performance or a rehearsal or something like that, or perhaps it's a recorded piece of music or something like that. So then you have to deal with this idea that there's an asymmetrical relationship between when you're making the painting, or how the painting is made, and how the painting is viewed. And often in certain contexts, like the art market, that asymmetrical relationship is not so good, right? Because the art market really loves the sort of unique objects that the fine arts produces, right? That traditional painting produces. But in terms of like artistic flexibility, it opens up a whole world where, because there's no specific way a digital painting has to be viewed, it can be validly viewed in a number of contexts, whether it's printed out, whether it's sort of projected live and discussed, which is what I do. I sort of do like sort of poetry readings, but with paintings. Or whether it's turned around or filtered or squashed or animated, those all become sort of like valid sort of viewings or readings of the information that comprises the picture. In the same way that, it doesn't matter how you read a poem, the poem it's still a valid reading of the poem, right? It's still a way of reading the poem. So that asymmetry is what's really interesting to me about digital painting in terms of how it sort of becomes viewable in that way.
You obviously make unique works. So you do make digital paintings that are set in a specific form, as a printout, for example. So how do you negotiate that? Have you sort of, I don't know, had long, deep conversation with a gallerist about how to do it, where to view things? Or how to view things, rather, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the marketability or like, making money off of creating a digital painting or something like that, well, it's quite different, right? So it depends on the different ways in which you want to have it viewed, right? So like being paid to give a performance, for example, is one type of way. Another way is, of course, printing it out. But then when you print something out, in the same way that when a photographer, like a contemporary photographer wants to make, an edition of 5 or something like that, or Jeff Koons makes an edition of 10 of his sculptures or something, right? You want to create an edition so that it can, sort of have its sort of time and place in the world. And yeah, generally when I print them out, I just do an edition of 1. So depending on what the contract could be with the buyer, if a painting is sold and then it is somehow damaged, then perhaps that could be reprinted from the original file, maybe not even at the same size. So it depends on the work. And a lot of my work is also just software, so it isn't actually just still images, and that work doesn't necessarily translate to something that could be printed.
No, of course not. And I think that's interesting because, we only met the other day, so I've been going through a lot of information that I can find online about you. And you keep coming back to certain words, like playful, keeping things light. Cute is another word that I really like. And it's something about how you talk about, say, David Hockney and his approach to painting as a painter and then finding the digital medium to do it. And you also come back to the mystery and something being mystical and fascinating. I like that because it makes it so much more maybe tangible somehow, and it turns into poetry.
Yeah, I think I always like to think of David Hockney as kind of being like not necessarily a painter because he's experimented with so many different forms of media, like doing photography and then writing about like the history of painting and he paints on an iPad in his old age, which is, David Hockney isn't only Britain's most expensive living painter, but he's also Britain's most expensive living digital painter. So that's
which is not bad.
Which is not bad, I guess. Yeah. No, that's a good thing. So I think I often think of David Hockney as being like kind of a media artist trapped inside a painter's body, because most of his work is actually more applicable to like media theory and the history of media art than it really is to painting. And even in his last like big show, people were talking about him as kind of not being a serious painter, being kind of like decorative and things, sort of like falling by the wayside or whatever. And I think in a way that's true because he is more of a media explorer or a media sort of theorist. He's tried to like understand depiction as opposed to just make, the best paintings or something like that. So I think like for David Hockney, all the mystery of painting comes out of the different media that is used to create the image and the different systems that are used. And I think that is basically a kind of digital painting idea. So if you go back to, I was in the National Portrait Gallery in London just last week and I saw like the Rembrandt self-portrait and that's a kind of portrait that has been known to be mysterious, but kind of like chemically mysterious. They're like, oh, well, how did he, put these things together? Like, what was his pigment? How did he get those colors? Like, what's the scientific sort of like, kind of like the chemical makeup of these things, and what was his studio like, and all these things, right? So it's partially a material kind of mystery, like what is actually the object made of, and partially a mystery about the process and stuff like that, right? I think with digital painting specifically, there is no mystery in the material because everything's so well documented. Like you can just look up how the pixel gets lit up or, how the technology works. The printer is kind of boring, you know. I mean, these are exciting technologies, but there's no mystery or magic in them. So what the digital painter has to do is they have to figure out how to bring the sort of spirituality and mystery into that medium. And the only way to do that I know of is to mess around with the process and the context and the sort of things around the painting, not necessarily the media itself, you know. There's no mystery in the media. There's just mystery in other places, I think.
So what skill set do you need then to be a digital painter?
I don't know. I think that you can have a variety of skill sets. I mean, it depends. It all depends on where the mystery is going to come from. So in my case, I produce software, and a lot of the software that I produce actually messes around with the different processes of painting. So it's not necessarily what the pixels are, what colors the pixels are in my paintings that's important so much as how the pixels are actually getting plotted. So the mental and software and hardware processes that are sort of, you know, being run in order for the pixels to actually get put there. You know, I think that's where the mystery sort of comes in. And that's also where all my like visual sort of formal inventiveness comes from, because I basically make drawing and painting tools, and then I use those tools, and then through using those tools, I like change the way that I see the world. So, for example, I have one tool in which I can make drawings using my camera, and then after a while of using that tool, I no longer even really have to use it to make my pictures. I can just sort of like look around at things, and even if I'm using a pencil, I can sort of draw in the way in which I would think that tool would work. So, yeah, I mean, it's this common thing, like if you take a photography class in art school or something, you might get really interested in photography for a while. But then many people, they don't become photographers, but they do kind of learn to see like a photographer. So I think one argument for the reason why we even have different kinds of like visual media is, you know, the media is not necessarily a tool for us to communicate with directly, but it's a tool for us to understand things, you know, in our own right. So you could look at a camera both as like a tool to communicate images across time and space, but you could also look at a camera as a way to help you just understand your own perception, and like sort of like think in a different way. As a kind of training device for your own mind. And that's kind of what my drawing software is. Yeah,
and I mean, I think that painters have traditionally used whatever technical device has been on the market. So the camera obscura or the camera. I mean, we've been using technical devices to make paintings, to understand the world, for as long as we know. So in that, it's nothing new.
Right. And like perspective, for example, if you look at the history of like how perspective drawing was developed, it was developed in tandem with, and specifically, a lot of its rules were sort of hardened and sort of crystallized after people started drawing from the camera obscura. So only after people started tracing reflected images did they really start to derive accurate perspective models that they could use outside of the camera to just synthesize different kinds of spaces.
Do you think that, because we were saying earlier, before we sat down here, we were talking about American culture being different to European culture, and especially the painting tradition. Do you think that a digital painting is different in America than it is in an American context, maybe I should say, because you have a different story, a different art history? Do you think it's different somehow, or
now we're getting into some nationalistic ideas? Is American digital painting somehow different than other digital painting?
Does it exist? Are there differences? Maybe it's not.
Yeah, I think there's certainly differences. I mean, the internet has created a kind of globalized culture, but I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I'm still trying to understand my Americanness in the world. But I think Americans are generally kind of pushy, and they sort of try to push forward into new ideas or new territory or whatever, you know, like westward expansion and stuff. And so I think in a way, like I haven't seen these kinds of theories or ideas about digital painting coming out of other places. So maybe I'm one example of the American version of digital painting, I guess you could say.
But it's about access as well, isn't it? Access to the media.
You mean being able to access the technology? Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, I think in the Western world, everyone pretty much has access to computer technology. So I don't know how unique that is. You know, I mean, if you're in Europe, you can also have a computer.
Oh, very much so, yeah.
So I think in that sense, it's pretty much flattened. But I think it's more of an attitude and an approach, you know? I mean, America is like always looking for new free space.